everyone, and welcome to One Chopper Podcast, episode 308. I'm Benjamin Yoder, here today to talk to you about everyone's favorite monolith soft video games again. So originally my plan was with this episode was to go and talk about the channel updates and stuff like that, and I ultimately decided to hold off on it. I would rather just show you what I plan to do with the channel and what I plan to do with the podcast, because the reality is that, like, I'm still building things myself, and, like, in terms of content and scripting and stuff like that, and the angle I want to take with certain videos and things like that. So sitting there trying to explain it all, I think it wouldn't be very interesting. So instead, I'm taking you down another monolith soft hole. And I know we talked about Summerbringer. We ranked Summerbringer last week, so if you didn't see that, you know, and you're interested in Summerbringer, you know, there you go. But I had a handful of, like, different updates in my life that have been somewhat related to monolith soft, and all kind of feeding into kind of a little bit of self-reflection that I've been doing in terms of how I used to write about games, how I think about games, how, you know, about Xenosaga in specific and things like that, right? So the three big things that kind of happened, well, maybe this is, the first thing's not a big thing. First thing is Summerbringer. I did the extra missions in there, and I will say, I think last time on the ranking podcast, I had not played them. Well, I know I had not played them, but I wasn't really sure if it would affect my ranking, and I don't think it does. We'll see next time I rank something on that list, and maybe I change my mind. But the extra missions, I think, are worth playing because it does have some extra details about some of the side characters, in particular one character that kind of felt fairly, I don't know if out of place is the right word, but she felt more like as a relationship tool between characters when they kind of give a little more backstory into, like, why she ended up the way she did and things like that. And, you know, Summerbringer is not a very heavy game in terms of story, like in terms of, like, character details and things like that, which is something I appreciate about it. So I wrapped that up. But the other two big things that happened was I restored the Speed Gamers articles that I've written on my own website. And so my Xenogears review is now up on the website. So I went ahead and read that. And then I also decided to, as I mentioned, I think a couple podcasts ago at this point, or maybe like 4 podcasts ago by the time you're hearing this, I went ahead and rewatched the story cutscenes for Xenosaga episode 1 and 2 as well. It's about, I think it was around 12 hours of story, and so I just, like, watched it while I was playing Walk It Out, which was, like, you know, a good time. Walk It Out is a great game to do rhythm walking with, and so watching the cutscenes is I think it's a very acceptable way to kind of consume that story, even if, like, sometimes you're in a very dramatic scene, and then, like, in Walk It Out, like, September from Earth, Wind and Fire or something like that, is playing in the background while everyone's crying kind of thing. So it was an interesting experience, but I think my brain is good enough to, like, disconnect those and not, like, ruin a scene's mood by, you know, some hippie hoppy music playing in the background from Walk It Out kind of thing. I still would get teary eyed during certain scenes and things like that too. So yeah, and doing those things, I had a lot of thoughts about Xenosaga, how I received it, or maybe I shouldn't say, like, well, yes, how I received it, but also how over time I think I have perceived my reaction to that game in a lot of ways, and I think also it made me kind of want to, in some ways, trust past me a little bit more from watching those things. So to jump into it, really, you know, if you don't know, man, I don't like, how many times should I explain Xenosaga on this podcast? I feel like, but if you don't know, Xenosaga 3-part series. I have not played 3. I have not watched the cutscenes for 3, so that stuff is still kind of outside the window. I'll talk a little bit about that. My cat just went running by, making a growling noise. I don't know if you heard that. So it's like a 3-part series, and it was originally going to be much longer, and they had to cut a bunch of things. Like, so there's like this really, especially like episode 1, this very, like, ambitious feeling to the story. And in episode 1 in particular, I think it is a real struggle for me to get tuned into certain parts of what makes Xenosaga distinct. And I think a lot of that comes down to Xenosaga is a very ambitious tale from, like, a scale kind of thing, right? In a lot of ways, I don't want to get too deep into it. It's like a multi-story thing with reincarnated people and spirits and things like that. And the kind of intention is that these characters be kind of reincarnated in different ways in different stories, which is not a bad idea, I will say. But the focus of, or like, there's this feeling that, like, the stories they're trying to tell in Xenosaga specifically wants you to be there from start to finish, part 1 through, I think it's like 6 parts. And it didn't seem like it was really confirmed whether there's like 6 games is what they were thinking, but there are 6 parts at least, and episode 1 is the first part of that, to my understanding. So the first game like really takes its time with its story details, and I think one of the big criticisms I've always had with Xenosaga's story in general is I would kind of sum it up as a game that requires knowledge of religion and like philosophical texts to understand. This is not what I'm saying today. This is what I think I was saying more recently still, but I think it was like something I had kind of settled my mind on with Xenosaga. And I wonder if a lot of that comes from episode 1 in particular. Because episode 1, basically, because it has so much runway in front of it, doesn't really do much of anything in terms of storytelling. What it really does is it lays a foundation for kind of like where the story will go. And instead of really offering, in my opinion, any real like satisfying story arcs within that, what you really get is a lot of little nubs, basically. Like, they will basically take these little thumbtacks and they'll put it there and be like, hey, planet 14 years ago disappeared. Remember that. Okay. Also, there's this thing called the Zohar. It's here. It has something to do with God. It's there. And like, so they start doing this, and like, if these things I'm mentioning right now are like the actually important things, so maybe bad examples, but like the things I remember off the top of my head are just like story details. But when you start getting deeper into Xenosaga Episode 1's story, it feels like every single cutscene wants to introduce to you a thumbtack, and it's like, here is detail. You learned about detail, and a lot of these details don't feel like they relate to each other. It often feels like people in the story knows what's happening, and when they mention things, they know what they're talking about, but they're keeping you out of the loop on a lot of it. And I think that's a fine thing to do. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do per se. I think a lot of video games do this, but I think it's the frequency of which Xenosaga does it. And so you get these little, like, here's like, oh, here's this German word that we assigned to thing that happened, and it gets put on the wall, and like, there's no details that kind of come with it. And so you just kind of like sit there and go like, well, this thing, they're highlighting it, so it seems pretty important, but there's no information here. And I don't know if I like how long I should hold on to this information. Am I expecting information like, soon about this, or is it just going to disappear into the ether forever kind of thing, right? And especially at the end of Xenosaga Episode 1, I kind of realized a lot of these things do not really get elaborated on in the first game. And so they just put a lot of these little story details. So like nothing really feels satisfying. And I feel like by the end of the game, I didn't really remember a lot of these hooks. I feel like there was like another planet that disappeared in Xenosaga Episode 1. I don't even remember what planet it was, if it was important. It happened. It was like the only planet they showed in a cutscene disappearing, I feel like, in Xenosaga Episode 1. But like, I don't remember the context of it. Then like the character goes there and he's like looking around, but I feel like other things happen when he's there. So it ends up like kind of just getting thrown off to the side. I don't know. There's a lot of weird like little things I feel like in Xenosaga where it's just like Episode 1 specifically, which again, it feels like they probably had a lot of like runway in front of them kind of thing. So it feels like they're taking their leisure time of like, here's stuff that's happening. You get some development with some, I don't know if side character is the right word, or even like antagonist is the right word. There's this dude in Xenosaga Episode 1. If you played it, you know who he is. He's a guy, he's like a military guy. And he is really like the sole focus of that story, I feel like. Nobody else really develops in that story in Episode 1. It's kind of his story. And he kind of goes through his thing, and you kind of go through his thing. And like that's probably the closest thing you get to like an actual story arc in Xenosaga Episode 1, I feel like. But like it feels like he is just like this story piece, and then like he just kind of disappears. I don't remember if he ever shows up in the story again. I'm sure he probably is important later on, but like vaguely, I appreciate and I like appreciate his story and his individual story as a person, but I don't really understand the context of why he's important by the end of Xenosaga Episode 1, and so I feel like a lot of that game is just, me sitting on details. Anyways, I feel like I'm rambling about this part of it, so let me just move on and say, so I think why I was always like, oh, religion, like religious, having familiarity with religious texts and what's it called, philosophy are important is because there is just like a lot of random quoting of, well, I don't want to say random. They do a lot of quotes from a lot of different things, like different books and things, or like, it seems like they're quoting things sometimes. There's like this dude you see on a tower and he's like quoting something and saying it. And like, you can kind of get the general vibe of what's happening, you know, based, or like what they're trying to imply based off like what the character is saying. But, you know, it's all done in this very like, I don't know how to put it, like, you know, poetic kind of, sometimes old English kind of way, right? And it is, I can kind of like understand why they're talking about this quote in this scene, but I don't have any context for the quote. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but like, I don't read a lot of books. I don't read a lot of philosophy. I'm not familiar with the Bible. I don't really know any of that stuff. And so when I get to that scene, I kind of look at it at face value, just like, okay, like this dude's just reading poetry. And I think in reality, those things don't matter. I think they are put there for a reason. And if you know what they are, you're going to get a little more context of what's happening. But I feel like it is a little more context. I don't think you're getting like really big story revelations based off, you know, what is going on with those kind of things. And I feel like it is only more important in the fact that Xenosaga as a franchise is effectively a broken one, right? Like that game was essentially kind of torn up and spit out, and then you got, you know, Xenosaga Episode 3 came out at the end of it, and you know, I think some people like Xenosaga Episode 3. I think a lot of people do. I don't particularly, but like, you know, they try to salvage what was essentially, you know, a fraction of what the story was that they were trying to tell, right? And so when you have so many things that were like touched on and maybe not elaborated in super, like a lot of depth and things like that, I feel like you kind of end up in a situation where you need to pull from outside media to better understand that. And in a lot of cases, there is like outside media for Xenosaga as well, where they have like a mobile game that happened. They have, you know, other stuff. It sounds like there's not like, I was reading a post. I was actually talking to the guy who runs Game Ficante about it. He sent me like a page that had like a lot of information, actually, a lot of very helpful information about the development of these games a little bit. I feel like maybe I had read a lot of that before, but it's like, it's just a good refresher, right? And I forgot the point I was trying to make. I was talking to him though. I guess, hello, there you go. I don't remember what I was trying to make with that point. But anyways, so, you know, there's just a lot of threads that just kind of get, left open with the game. So you have to like, you know, put your own points between these threads. So you have to use those things like Bible verses and like these philosophy studies to make the connections between these dots, because the games themselves never made these connections for you, or at least they didn't get to do it. Whether they would have ever done it at some point, you know, it's hard to say. Nobody, you know, has the final script to that game. Oh, I remember what I was talking about when I was talking about Game Ficante. So that article he sent me mentioned the fact that there's like no Xenosaga Perfect Works release kind of thing. Like Xenogears before this had like a whole explainer book about what's going on, basically. And it sounds like Xenosaga never really got that, which is I was not aware of. But, you know, I'm not tuned into Xenosaga's story. I don't really care that much about, you know, this greater like universe of storytelling that Xenosaga and Xenogears has personally. And so it just kind of feels like maybe I overly emphasize these quotes and things like that, because that's what I see what people hold on to when they talk about Xenosaga and Xenogears. And I think it literally just comes from the fact that like things are just not fully detailed. So people have to kind of grab on to these other things that explain it. And because they're fairly complicated subjects and things like that, you know, they do kind of require a bit more reading than just, you know, your typical thing of just like, oh, I have personal experience with something like this in my life, and that can help me kind of empathize with certain things. Like sometimes, you know, when you have this kind of delivery that kind of gives you a quote or something like that, it just gives you a bit more insight into what's going on, I guess. So I guess that's the thing. Like, I don't know if this makes any sense. I hope it's making sense. But like, I guess that's the thing maybe I overly blamed in the past, is like, you got to know these books to know what's going on in Xenosaga. And that's not true. That is not true, in my opinion, at this point. I think I really just looked at them, didn't know what was happening, and I saw the people kind of emphasizing these points when they talked about them. And at the end of the day, you know, I don't think the game really relies on this stuff that much. I think the bigger problem with episode 1 probably is just opening of a lot of threads and not, well, I haven't revisited Xenosaga episode 3 yet, but like seemingly not really doing anything with them. And even if it did, like it's like for opening episode 1 chapter, like it does not feel satisfactory in my opinion, storytelling wise. It feels like it really just kind of ends and nothing really happens kind of thing. So I think a lot of the root of my feeling about Xenosaga maybe came from episode 1. Again, I have not watched episode 3 again yet. So I think that is like a big thing. So I don't think I was like wrong in how I felt about Xenosaga is the thing I think I'm kind of realizing. And it's just like how I described it was probably wrong. And what I thought were my frustrations, I think I was kind of misattributing them to something else in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of that was influenced by how people talk about Xenosaga and Xenogears. In my opinion, I think that's probably the case. But you know, I think ultimately I was really happy I did like rewatch Xenosaga 1, and you know, I think I'm glad I did not replay it because I think I would have felt unsatisfied in that regard. And I would have felt like I spent a lot of time on it. It's like a 40-hour game, right? And like it would have been a lot of time to kind of come to a conclusion that, well, it's definitely like a adjustment of my thoughts and expectations. I think does not really fall that far out of what my expectations of my past self really were. And one thing I think I might need to do more is kind of trust my past self a little bit more. And the reason I say this is because in doing this, I went back and read my review on Xenogears and Xenosaga episode 3. And I think in the same way with Xenosaga episode 1, I think I was like misinterpreting how I felt about certain things. I think when I dig down into those reviews that I wrote, I can see where I'm coming from. I think I just either didn't know that's what I was trying to say, or I didn't know how to express myself properly or as in-depth as I was hoping. And so sometimes I think you can kind of see that, like I have to kind of pull that out of like how I wrote about games sometimes. And I was reading like my Xenogears review, and if you know like what I've said when I previously ranked Xenogears, it's like this is like a black hole game in my mind. And I was like, I don't remember why I can't remember this game. And I went and read my review about it after I restored it on the website. Again, you can read it. I'll link it if you want to read it. But again, it's a very boring review, and it's because it's just like, yeah, this is a game. like I was like trying to find things to praise about that game, and I ended up basically kind of being like, there's some neat leveling up stuff, and the story gets weird at the end. I feel like that's like if I could sum up my entire review as that in a lot of ways. And I think the rest of the review is just like, here, let me explain the video game to you. And I think whenever I have a review that's like, let me explain the video game to you, and that's kind of all I do in this thing, a lot of times it's like, oh, I did not care about that game is the problem. And I think really like what Xenogears has become or was to me at the time, and I think a lot of games have kind of entered this zone for me in a lot of ways. It's just like, it is the Super Mario Brothers 3 zone where like, it's kind of so normal in a lot of ways that I just do not care. And there's nothing wrong with a game like that. And I gave Xenogears like an 8.5. And scores, like, what does that really mean? You know, is a whole other thing. I gave it 8.5 in the sense of like, I'm thinking about this as like an IGN review for the mainstream audience. I gave Mindjack a 3. Mindjack is a game I adore. I give it a 3 out of 10. So, you know, my scoring system was all messed up back then because I was really just, you know, reviewing games for the mass market, which I think is what a lot of people end up doing early on, or at least back then, a lot of people ended up doing that early on. And so like Xenogears, I think as a game, just like like, in reading that, I think the thing I read from Xenogears is just like, it was fine. It was good and fine. And there's not much more to say than that. And so I think initially I was like, maybe it's like Xenogears is a game I need to revisit as well. And I was like, I think maybe I don't need to revisit Xenogears, because it sounds like I did play it. I did understand what was happening. I did blame religion and stuff a little bit in there as well, but I think that's probably just residual feelings from Xenosaga personally. And I honestly think probably, like, based on my memory of Xenogears, again, it is a giant black hole in my head. I feel like it might be a little bit better about, like, opening in a more conservative way that doesn't just, like, introduce tons of threads all the time. I could be wrong about that, but, like, you know, and again, that's not a trait that does not happen in video games. It's just that Xenosaga Episode 1 feels excessive in that way. And I'm guessing Gears probably is a little more balanced just because it has a more, like, grounded setting at the beginning. And I think it's, like, one thing that game has that's pretty nice is you have, like, a really nice kind of early game atmosphere that they do a really good job, I think, of disrupting in a lot of ways. But anyways, so that is just, like, how I feel. And so I used to kind of laugh at my Xenosaga Episode 3 review and be like, oh, it's just bad. It's garbage. I wasn't giving the game a chance. I can't pull anything about it kind of thing. And I think I was just really worried about, I was just looking at surface level stuff with Xenosaga Episode 3. That review, surface level stuff on my review of that. And when I dig into that review deeper, and I think about each line of why I said what I said, again, ignoring the stuff that's just like, here's how a video game works. It actually, I think, makes a lot of sense what I say in there. Again, kind of the IGN score layer there where I get like a 7.8 or something like that. And like, I think I praise it a lot of times, like doing better than this with Xenosaga. Like, it's the best game in the series in this regard, without really focusing on the fact that, like, from a gameplay perspective, I did not like that game at all. And it was like one of the more frustrating experiences as a Monolith Soft fan. And I think that's something I might go back and just like play around with that battle system a little bit more. Make sure I'm not missing anything there. But I don't think I am. That I might actually go back and do at some point. But you know, I think the only thing I really came away with from the only thing that I really don't feel confident about is Shion in Xenosaga Episode 3. I don't talk about Shion in that review. Interesting point. Well, actually, no, I do, briefly. I kind of complain about Shion for a little bit, but it's not a big part of that review. And so I think that's the big thing, is like, can I be empathetic with Shion as a character? Because at the time, I did not like Shion at all. And I think that's like my big question mark still with Xenosaga Episode 3. And I don't really talk about it in there. I just say she's like really whiny, and I'm not necessarily opposed to a character that's very whiny in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of times characters can become unlikable, and story-wise it can make sense, but in the case of Shion, at least it did not really jump on me. And I think there's a lot of weird stuff I feel about Shion and how she treats her friends in specific that really bothers me. But anyways, so that's like the big question mark. But really, I think the rest of the review I can probably trust in the fact of like what I said about the combat, just it being like overly simple. And also the fact that I was just like, hey, when the game ends, it's not a satisfying conclusion. It feels like it just kind of ends. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be said about, you know, leaving open-ended parts to games to make sure, like, there's space for a sequel. But the problem with Xenosaga as a whole is that, like, it doesn't ever really feel like it does that. And I think that's also the case with Xenosaga Episode 3 as well. And in rewatching those cutscenes, maybe I'll feel differently. I'll update you guys if that happens. I think I will watch it, but it's like 10 hours of cutscenes. I'm like, oh boy. But it sounds like a lot of it is actually voice acted despite not being like fully animated cutscene. With Xenosaga 3, they really cut the budget on the cutscenes, which is like perfectly understandable given what's going on with that game. So, I'm really hopeful that I do at least find like empathy for Shion in specific. But, you know, I think that's the big thing that I maybe have pulled away from like a personal level is just like, you know, old me was not necessarily wrong. I may not know what I was talking about per se, but I think it's worth exploring what I was thinking and making sure I understand where I was coming from, even if I don't necessarily, in some ways, sympathize with where I was coming from, even if I don't necessarily know, if the words were right. And I think one of the things that made it a little bit healthier for me to do it this way, and I think this is actually a healthy thing to do a lot of times, is just like when you're being critical of yourself, look at yourself as somebody else. And so when I look at the writing I did about Xenosaga, if that was somebody else, I would look at it and be like, hey, that writing's bad. No, I wouldn't say that. It is really bad writing. There's like bad punctuation in there too. I mean, I don't have the greatest punctuation today either, but the bigger thing is like, I think the big thing would, if I read somebody's review like that and I was like somebody I was trying to actually learn from, I could pull meaning from that review, and really giving myself the time to pull meaning from that review, I think was really important. Rather than just, I think previously I've kind of wrote those old reviews off because like these are written so poorly that they're just like, I don't trust myself. And I think just because you can't communicate well doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have like solid thoughts about a game, right? Maybe part of this comes from like me talking about conversations about games and things like that too, where I'm just like, sometimes people don't have the words for how they feel. And that doesn't mean that you get them in a corner with the trump card, right? And you're like, oh, well, you're wrong. No, it just means that they don't know how to communicate it. And like, you should, if you can, help them communicate that, right? And I think that's a good thing to do. And I think in a lot of ways I was treating myself that way now, of just saying like, what were you, Ben, from 10 years ago, or 10 plus years ago now, trying to communicate and focusing on that rather than just like, where's your periods at, buddy? How much did you complain about the loud footsteps in the game? Because there was like 3 sentences about it for some reason. So anyway, so I'm really glad. And I think in having that kind of thought about, how I felt about the game and in trusting myself and how I felt about those games, I think I maybe am at the point that I'm like, I don't really need to play Xenosaga Episode 3 again, I think. I was really thinking that I might, because I was like, I have bigger problems with Xenosaga Episode 3 that I would really like to address. But I think at the end of the day, like, I should have confidence in what I said back then, especially if I look down and look at what's there and say, yeah, I do see that. And I don't think it's a bad idea to kind of check myself. And I think in a lot of ways, like, it is good to make sure, like, especially when you're like reviewing your old stuff, of just like make sure everything seems sound. But I think I don't necessarily need to throw everything out and then say, well, Ben was wrong, I have to start over and play this game fresh, right? And I'm hoping that that is something that helps me in the future and saves me time in the future as well. So, but I do want to like I mentioned, maybe touch the Xenosaga Episode 3 battle system a little bit, just to kind of challenge my belief of how I felt about it back then. But I think the general consensus is that that battle system is not the best kind of thing. The one thing I think I would still really benefit from, though, with Xenosaga and Baten Kaitos, is that I really like the dungeon designs in those games, and I think it's good for me to be confident in feeling that, and I do feel that way, the same way I felt confident about like my feelings about, the Xenosaga game's battle systems and Baten Kaitos' battle systems and things like that. But I don't remember the details super well, so it's hard for me to talk about it. And that could just be watching a video, honestly, and that may be what it is. Although if I ever did like a greater video about it, it would be helpful to have gameplay, my own gameplay, but it's not required, right? So that would be the nice thing. And maybe this is not something I really had to worry about so much, but I maybe like somewhat started to doubt myself with Xenosaga Episode 2 at times. If you don't know, Xenosaga Episode 2 is kind of the biggest disliked game in that series for a lot of reasons. And like that site, I'll link the site that Game Ficante sent me, because if you want to learn about Xenosaga, there's a whole explanation of a bunch of stuff there. But like, I feel so bad because like there's like a big chunk of that page is about like how bad Xenosaga 2 went down internally. Just it sounded like there's a lot of bad blood. A lot of people kind of, I don't know if blaming other people's the right word, but not being respectful of each other's work in a lot of ways. And I understand it. Like if you give somebody like the biggest one is like one of the writers who like seemed very upset about how they handled her story and kind of changing a lot of it. But I also like try really hard to be sympathetic with like, hey, you got to make a video game still, right? Like the team had to make a video game, and And there's a lot of issues with like episode 1 specifically. So it sounds like there's a lot of struggle with episode 2 and putting that thing together and being sympathetic that like while they maybe didn't make like the best possible thing it could have been, I'm a big believer in that whole saying that like every video game that comes out is like a small miracle or something like that. So I'm sure people who put their blood, sweat, and tears in that game, A, had problems with it, but B, they also, didn't make any changes, as a negative harm, I feel like, kind of thing, right? They weren't trying to hurt anybody, I feel like. Very unlikely, at least. So, but yeah, that stuff aside, though, if you don't know, my Monolith Soft chart of like ranked games by tier, Xenosaga Episode 2 is actually an A ranked game, and maybe a little like ambitious in that regard, I think, but like, I just think it's a really cool game, and like, there's a lot of really cool things about the battle system. And I think that maybe the part that I was like also maybe a little bit more unsure of, and I don't have a review for Xenosaga 1 and 2, I will say, so it's not something I could have just gone back and read, unfortunately, but I had a fairly strong memory about Xenosaga 1 and 2 from a game perspective, and I revisited it with the Xenosaga or Xenoblade 3 video, so like I have more familiarity with it now that I messed with it again. But the big thing was like the story part. And I remember liking Xenoblade or Xenosaga 2's story, and it seems like a lot of people do not like Xenosaga 2's story. And a lot of complaints about action scenes. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big action scene guy either. Like, I think action scenes are good, but when they're overdone, it gets a little tiring. And Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is maybe a game that I think is one of the worst in Monolith Soft's case of just like, especially up front. There's just a lot of action scenes up front, and they don't add anything to the story, in my opinion, other than just say, war's happening, buddy. So in my opinion, that's maybe the worst, biggest offender in more recent years. And, I think the Xenoblade Chronicles 2 fight scenes are fine. That's all side. There are complaints about this game having too many fight scenes, like in cinematic things, but I don't think it was that many, honestly. It is a shorter game, though. And then also the story didn't focus on Shion, the main character. It focuses on this other guy, Junior. And Junior's like an important side character, I will say. And I think that Junior's story is actually a really good story. And it sounds like a lot of that is for like leftover from that writer who was like kind of falling off the project. But like, I think it's a really strong story in that game. And I feel like actual character development feels like it happens. And it feels like you're learning about what's happening in the world. And you're getting character development through how characters are interacting with each other more directly, I think. And it really helps build Junior, Ziggy, and Momo's story in a very strong way. And I don't think that's a bad thing, especially when you're thinking about this game in the context of a multi-episode thing, right? Like, at some point, you need to focus on their story and, like, really giving them their own, in a lot of ways, their own game to kind of thrive. I think was actually pretty important. And like the fact that Xenosaga Episode 3 turns out the way it did, where it's like, we have to wrap this up. So guess what? Shion Uzuki is the only character in this game that matters along with Cosmos, right? Like it probably honestly works out where Episode 2 is just like, we got to get the story details for all these other guys in. Plop, 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 plop. And they just like kind of do most of their story in that thing. Now Ziggy has his own story that's like a mobile game thing, and I haven't read that. But I kind of feel like Ziggy's a strong character even without that mobile game in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about whether I'll read the mobile game. It's not available anymore. You can't play, or at least I think it's lost media for the most part. But there was a translation of the script of it at some point. So and so yeah, I feel like Xenosaga Episode 2 is actually a really strong game in terms of storytelling as well, because at least in the context of Xenosaga, because it feels like it goes from that opening section of just like threads everywhere to actually starting to tie them together, right? And then trying to figure out which are the right ties to start making. And I think they start making the right ties, in my opinion, in the characters. And Shion is a part of this game, and she does like have her story elements, and there is kind of the whole thing with like her struggle with the military and giving up Cosmos, her like robot, lady friend or whatever, depending on who you are. Some people are like lady lover, whatever you want to say, lady daughter, like, I don't know. But it is still a part of that game. And I feel like, honestly, I think it in my eyes, if that's your main character and that story's going to advance still, I think it makes sense for her to kind of advance in the background of these kind of bigger stories that are happening. Because I feel like a lot of times with at least episode 3 specifically, my memory at least, is that a lot of these other characters don't feel like they advance anymore alongside Shion. So I think like just giving them their time to shine in episode 2 was like a good choice, despite, the fact that, it was maybe not the best way to do that story. And then like Monolith Soft, very common for them to like kind of flesh out their side characters early on, and then the back half of the game it's really just focused on the two main people, typically the boy and the girl kind of thing, right? So anyways, those are my raw thoughts after I did those, and hopefully that's interesting. Hopefully that was something. I am very glad that I have rewatched Xenosaga. I don't feel a strong need to replay those games anymore, the first 2. And I think 3, after I like really sat down and like started rethinking how I want to reread my old content, I think 3 is something that I might also just kind of leave off the plate and just maybe, poke at it a little bit more, maybe really dig into that combat, just see if something is there that I can really appreciate other than just the break system, kind of in some ways starting there, although I would argue in Xenosaga episode 2, that's where it really started. But, the break system is there and I can appreciate that, but, it doesn't mean I have to, that I'd like it either, right? Like Soulbringer is a game that story-wise, I very much enjoy. World-wise, very much enjoy. Gameplay-wise, but, So anyways, that is it, though. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for coming. Like I said, I should be back in the U.S. next week, barring any passport losing, or any other thing happening. So I should be back. And I also have a panel that's going to be at a ShineCon when I get back as well. Although that is already a panel I've already done, so there's nothing new there as far as I'm aware, unless I say something very interesting and different that makes me go like, maybe I should upload this to YouTube. But I think it's probably gonna maybe just stay on the side. I don't really know if I need to upload like multiple panels onto like YouTube that's the same topic essentially, right? So anyways, that's it. Thank you guys for coming. OneControl.com is the website, and I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next week. Bye.